All right, bye, Ned. Bye, Dylan. Good evening, everybody. All right, today's sunset, 7:18 p.m., 6:18 p.m. on Standard Time. Sunrise today, 7:01 a.m. Yeah, 6:01 a.m. on Standard Time. The early part of the Ballard year, to bring us the Ballard year under that of Harold Ballard. Looking back at an era where the Leafs were not great. We were in an era where the Leafs were not great. And they were for a very consistently long period of time. They were really bad we had some really, really bad seasons in that era. Actually, two were in the 1980s. They actually had a lot of bad seasons. Especially the peak of the Ballard era was in the 1980s. And that was how bad it was. That was, I think, the darkest for the Leafs in franchise history. The darkest decade overall was the 80s. And then when Edmonton was way better than Toronto, Harold Ballard was the owner. Harold Ballard, how many years ago it was, and this was how about over 40 years ago, comparing some of these seasons to this upcoming one, and that is that the 1980s was 40 years ago. The 40. And there were actually some really bad seasons in that stretch. And some bad lead teams in that era. And then back in where everybody I had to go around. The north, especially two of them were that era when they were 48 points in 80 games. Okay, we ain't making it. Oh, I can't make it. We can't make it. Got slowed down. Okay, rush. Okay. This was the worst season under Harold Ballard. The time Harold Ballard and after the Ballard era, and actually the team in the 90s and 2000s were until I think 1979 on the years 1979 to 1992. Had pretty much bad records from like 1979 to 1992. It was the year she was Piner Hilton when they started being good again. They haven't had some really, really bad seasons then. And there was one in particularly when they had a really, really bad season, but still made the playoffs, and that was 1987-88. Yeah? How old were you? I think, would have that been your 10-year-old season? And you were born in 1977. Because everybody that was alive then. You were very young. My answer would be you would have been 7 years old when that is. You would have been born during the height of the Ballard era. We were in an era where I think of some of the worst seasons in franchise. I'm talking about as a branch, I believe as a franchise. The third worst season was the 1987-88 season. Then we have forever. What is their worst record in 84-85? Since 84. And there were some bad and even really bad seasons. Bad and maybe really bad seasons in that era, in that stretch. Some bad and some really bad seasons in that stretch. At the time, we were in an era where everybody was making the playoffs with losing records, no matter the record they had. But this is the 1980s. But for Buffalo, this isn't the 1980s anymore. Where everybody's making it with losing records. The New York Rangers, where Toronto and New York, it hasn't happened, but it hasn't happened in many, many years that they quit. And now they made it a lot more easier for teams to make the playoffs, but no, I think they would have been at the time. The league was much smaller back in the day. I think, and you taking the 11 teams out of it, you would have had 21 teams. And in the 80s, around the time Mrs. Vickers was young, this was around the time period when I wasn't even born. And this was many, many years, and this was around the time, especially the 1984-85 season, that was my dad's final year at Central Collegiate. And that was the year Dad was in his final year at Central. Actually, I checked the worst season, the 1984-85 season, at the peak of the Bauer was probably the worst season of the Bauer era. When my dad's graduating year, when my dad graduated from high school, was when my dad graduated high school. Automatically, because his dad I remember particularly that year. How was Grandpa Reynolds handled it? Did he handle that season? Rob? Like, have there been any seasons like really, really bad? Like, what was the worst season you watched? You seen really in the back in the day? It's a very long time. Like, if you recall. Yeah, because we weren't alive then, but Heinrich wasn't around then either. I don't think even Bev Morgan. I don't think Beverly Morgan was around either. So I think this school opened in Heinrich opened the store in '92, so that was in 2 years after Ballard died. That was when Ballard died. And that was in 2 years after he passed. He passed away. After he passed, the team went into a rebuild. The team overall went into a rebuild. And then turned the corner. I think they went through a retool in '97 and '98. And then they came back, but then the darkest, I think, overall for them would have been the '80s, and then the second half of the 2000s and 2010s. And that's where, if we don't, I don't think we've ever had a season as bad as like the 1980s. You think that you were at the time, Mr. Craig? Besides Dylan didn't come on last year. Took a week off and said, this mortally was the worst season since the since the early 80s. And this is back at a time when, this was back at a time when people were making it with losing records, with any record we had. But I think today's date is almost September 20th. So we know that we haven't had seasons as bad as this in a very long time. Even mine died. And you go back to the '80s and back into like the late '90s, like the early teams, like the '90s, and pretty much the darker times for the league. So the Harold Ballard era, that's what defined the Harold Ballard era. The Harold Ballard era. And that's what, in some of these seasons that I talked about her in that era are among the worst. So the 1980s sticks out to me. I hope you're keeping up here. 1980s, and I hope you're keeping up here. And this is very important information here. 1980s. I hope you're keeping up with this here. The last time Believe had a particularly not really bad year, but the last time the worst season in franchise history occurred in this brief run of recent seasons that were among one of the worst seasons in the history of the team. Occurred in an era where the team keep in mind, guys, the Leafs, I hope you're keeping up with this because was there a power outage? It's not a lot of lights are on. I don't think I don't know if Pinehurst is open. I don't think it's open, but I don't think it's open. It looks very dim. But it's more dimly. But some of these lights are very, very dim, and it looks power out. But the building is pretty much closed. This goes back to an era where I believe we're not great. Especially 1980. 1980.
Is there anybody down there?
No, I don't think. I think back to an era where school first opened. Feels a lot like that year, because that stretch of time for the Leafs. I think back to an era where the Leafs we didn't have great seasons. But like this run of seasons like I've seen now, the 23-24, 24-25, it's starting to kind of resemble kind of that stretch that we've had in the 2000s when the Leafs weren't great, but we haven't had a particularly nightmare season for the team since 1988. Since 1988. So we haven't had a particularly nightmare season, but where they were really bad. Where the team was really bad. Like really, really, really bad. I mean like not even reaching 60 points. The 80s, that's what describes the 1980s for the Toronto Maple Leafs franchise. Door is open. I'm not going in. I know I'm not supposed to be in there. There's no one should be in that building. Something's propped open. I should tell someone that the door is propped open. one of the doors are propped open here at Pine Ridge. There's a door propped open. There's a door propped open. There's no one here. There's no civilians around, so some of the lights are very, very dim. There are some lights left on. It is very, very dim. But I think back to an era where the Leafs weren't great at the time, where we didn't have some great and very, very some bad seasons in the Norris. That's actually how really weak the Norris division was. For the time, how weak the Norris division was. Because at the time that the Norris division died, that around the Bauer died, when Bauer, some of his from the recent seasons, especially the run of, I don't want to open it, I want to change it. But there were some really bad seasons. Where's Austin? Like, if you go down there, like, is it keep going? Or, like, in the Harold Bauer era, up until about, for most of the years up until about this era, we haven't had like a really, really bad season since the time of Bauer. Exactly, yeah, this phone is old. And I only bought this like 3 years ago. And I only bought this phone like 3 years ago. Nearly 3 years ago, and I don't know how much life it has in it, because eventually this thing's probably not going to work for any live streaming at all. Because my God, the lifespan of it lasts. But we're in an era now where they don't think we're ever going to have an era like that yet, unless we really are going to, at some point in the future, when Matthews, Marner, or Matthews, Nylander, and Tavares all start regressing. I think we could be looking at that we haven't had particularly nightmare seasons since particularly 1991, but back to the 1990s. Some of these seasons, especially in the 1980s, I think back to some of the seasons in that era, and everyone made the playoffs with a losing record, but keep in mind, guys, this is a very long time ago now. We're from that era to now. That's a very long time ago now. Right? And we haven't had particularly bad season since, so particularly some low points for the franchise. So I hope you're keeping up with this. Because this is all important. The last time they've had like a really bad, severely bad season was 1984-85, or the last really severely bad season, like where they missed the playoffs, where it was bad enough, was when they had 52 points in 87-88. So clearly they have had some bad seasons, really bad seasons in the 80s. But nowadays, I honestly don't know if we're trending in that direction for Toronto at some point in the future. If we're not, do you think we're honestly looking at the Leafs are in a retool, but they weren't. There was just simply no structure, not going in the direction. Like, in my opinion, that's now kind of feels about how bad Buffalo's been for over a decade now. And man, if it was a Leaf fan not making the playoffs for that long, if this was like the entire 1980s and into the 90s, I would honestly feel bad for Leaf Nation, for Leaf fans, because that would the 1980s was an awful, like probably a really awful stretch, and that was the stretch of your childhood, of Jeff's childhood, of Jeff, about how bad the Leafs were during your childhood in the 1980s, which is during your childhood, your child. But I don't think we're trending toward that. Talking at some point in the future, or we don't know if we're gonna have a season like even more of a nightmare. We haven't had a nightmare season for the team since 1988. So there's gonna be some major talk here if things go south this season, and if they are really, really slow, if they start really slow, and particularly some of the worst, and this is probably one of the lowest points we've seen for Toronto. Actually, they didn't turn all of them off. No one's here in the building. I don't think there are any overtimes this Saturday. Apparently, I was told that I don't think there. I think there seem to be more on Sundays. I don't know if they're doing the overtime on Saturdays now. But Pine Ridge is. But during a time period, particularly in the 1980s, was a really dark time for the Leafs. If you think back to an era, if you go back to some of their worst seasons, if you can think back to an era uh, 1987, 88. This is 1987. 88, in my 88, in my opinion. But we're getting some of like the definitely at the time where Vibe, where we had people like Vibe. I think Wendell Hart was around for a time. I think Wendell Hart. I think it was Wendell Hart was around in that era. We had a lot of these players around in that era. We had Wendell Hart. We had Wendell Hart. Wendell Hart was around at that time. Ingham Bauer, Nathan. Doug Gilmore was. I think we had. Armstrong was coach, I believe, and he was an owner of the Maple Leafs at one point. That was when things were like officially bad for the team. In the 1980s, particularly how bad they were, they went from they started falling from the dynasty, and it was like and no direction, no. Somehow they backed into the playoffs, and then honestly, the dark eras are still around now, and the ghosts of the past are still there with this team, even now. But particularly, they haven't missed the playoffs, which it would be associated if we go into a full rebuild. That would be more appropriate to say that they're nightmare season. That there have been a couple nightmare seasons. That was an outright nightmare season, but they still made the playoffs. But 300 points percentage is not good. It's not good for the time for the franchise, and that's just how it really shows to me just how bad this franchise was for most of the years, pretty much up until. This is the third worst record in franchise history, and this is when a lot of us, including myself, were not or for a lot of life. I think so. Once again, we're wondering, are we trending in a similar direction with the Leafs? But I don't think we are. But if we're wondering with an owner, hopefully we're not altering ourselves down toward is at the bottom like we saw in the 80s. Especially the Buffalo Sabres and how bad the Leafs were for the 80s were quite a lot different between those two. And it feels a lot more like the Leafs of like the 80s and then of the 80s and probably a part of the 90s, like the early, especially 92, maybe making the playoffs with losing records. Pretty much the really bad seasons from 1979 to all the way till 1992. When the whole and this was before, so hovering the era before the school. So this would have been at a time where this place would definitely, back in that time, school didn't even exist in the 80s. In that time, in 1980, so it would have been, Pickering would have been definitely more smaller compared to now. We're still building up, but for most of us, I think the world's population would have been a lot smaller back in that time period when we had no direction, and this is like that time where the team throughout the 80s where definitely most of Pickering was starting to get built up. And this was at a time where I believe there were two really bad decades I think we had within the franchise. One was in the 80s, and I think we had another really bad stretch in the 2000s and early 2010s, where we all thought the 2010s was probably, it had to do with 2013, they would have been. If we ever had a really bad owner at the time, I think it would have been when you eventually were getting your elementary into high. I think the last time it was 1990. The last time we had a really bad season, not even below 400, was 1992. 93 was the worst. I if we can date these seasons back by order by win, you can see that they've had some really low points competitiveness back then, but we were in an era where the Leafs were not. Hoping that this fight isn't quicker in itself. But we're starting to get to that stage where I think we know that the light bulb here. We know that we were in a time period where just how much lower the Maple Leafs were. Yeah, notice the difference in decades, how much lower the Leafs were in the 80s and definitely in through the 90s, like the 70s and into the 80s, from I think the late 70s. So this would have been a time where eventually where everything was definitely the most darkest and most really turbulent time for the Leafs. But the Maple Leafs have not had a great decade since the 1980s and since definitely the 90s. But the 90s was very different from that time is compared to now. Because we were in an era where the Leafs we didn't have a lot of this. None of that existed back then. This was before today's better type of internet and stuff. None of that overtime losses, and this was before we had the overtime or actually any overtime or shootout losses and stuff. So you're going back to a time a very long time ago. Or even before we even have salary cap, so this goes back to a very long time ago. A very long time ago. So even 8 years before Batman came in, this goes back a very long time ago before they actually started to spread the record out to include. I think once they started introducing the overtime losses, I think we stopped seeing it once we started seeing overtime losses. But because the fact that the North Division was at the time was very weak. And you can see just how weak the Atlantic Division was. But we were in an era at the time. Because at the time, but if we were in a time where the Leafs were not playing well, both on the ice and seeing just how bad their seasons were until now, until we got to the very recent years where somebody wants to hear me. Hi, Mohammed. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. How about you?
I'm doing good.
How was your day?
My day's doing well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Mm,
how's Nora doing?
Nora's doing good.
Yeah. Well,
Mm,
it's the weather is warm today. It's actually starting to
yeah.
get a little bit. It's definitely starting to get cooler out.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's feeling a lot more like we're starting to go into what winter is nearing.
Don't talk about winter. I hate winter.
Yeah, it's fall, but we're in fall
My
right
mom,
now.
my mom hates winter. I hate winter.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
do you think that at some point, like, uh, so how are things going at your new school?
My new school
Yeah.
is doing good. I made a lot of friends,
Yeah.
and I had to wear the uniform.
Yeah.
School, yeah. Mm,
Yeah.
And
So,
I had to,
like,
and I had to wear black shoes. I cannot wear no other like shoes. I had to wear black.
yeah.
Mm. Sorry, my sister.
Well, Mohammed, it's nice to see you. And nice that we can. It's nice to see you again on here.
Yeah. Happy Saturday.
Yeah. All right, Mohammed. Have a nice day.
You too, Dylan. Bye bye.
Bye. Bye. I'm with my friend Mohammed, but I want to get back into the leaf. So I think we can honestly call it here if we wanted to. We don't have to keep it going. It's gonna get really dark here. But I think back to a time, and there was actually a time where the leaves weren't green. Well, but I wanted to talk about an era of the leaves where they weren't great. Like awful and both in terms of being really bad all out. And this was back in the 80s where the leaves there were there were some really bad seasons here. There were some, but yeah, there were some, but I wanted to talk about some of the worst winning seasons they've had. Yeah, they were times. I think they ended up finishing with a really bad points percentage. They were 325 that year in 1980, in the 1980s, especially that time period. This is how time period where Ballard was definitely getting up in age. And this was really starting to show that Ballard, especially was getting up in age, and was getting up in age, how that King Clancy passed away was King Clancy passed away in 1986. Actually, it was on the 10th of November. Yeah, yeah, like, yeah, it's the early time period where I think mom was My mom was still in high school. Hey, my mom and dad would have both been out of high school back when they got engaged. Back when mom and dad were engaged. And eventually we were all born. Then we were all born. I was born in 2003. But the leaves, if you compare the time period, and my battery life is actually going down much quickly now. But as far as well, YouTube videos are going down and they're taking the videos down much quicker, but think back to a time period where the leaves were not green. I'm gonna have to say the 80s. The answer was 1987. The answer was 1987. Or 1988. 87, 88. But they actually had some really good starts. But well, yeah. Yeah. But they were like a 325. Hey. When their winning percentage was a lot worse. And that there were a lot of stretches in that era in the Leafs throughout franchise history that shows just how weak the franchise have really been. And we have to go 1987. So one of the years was 19. You have to go back into the history of 5 years like that where they were not even rebuilding. But in the periods where they luckily weren't like bad, but they were winless. Back in the 1980s, back when Ballard, yeah, yeah, because it definitely has not felt that way for the Leafs in a long time until years that they did not make the playoffs. When they did not make the playoffs a lot, especially. Yeah, they honestly would have missed in other divisions. Because in every other division, I think they would have missed playoffs. They would have definitely been out. But they were getting a lot of high-end draft picks at the time. But and we've seen eras like what we saw with Buffalo. What we're seeing with Buffalo now is it's very much similar. Similarities are showing up in that comparing the eras of people like Daryl Sittler, Lanny McDonald was around at that time, but the 1980s and into the 80s especially, but in the 80s, we didn't see a lot of great teams in that era, especially how bad But there were a lot of like sad tough seasons for Leaf fans. For Leaf fans, pretty much up and down in the eras. But that was like a really dark time where they were either at or near the bottom of the standings a lot. And we had something very similar to that. And that's happened very similarly a few times too in some years. Well, there were a lot of other years as well where they weren't great, especially not in the Bauer era, but we're talking like in the eras where they were in the semi-mediocrity, and there was a lot. Yeah. So we were looking at this year back in the yeah. Yeah. If we got, I don't know how many years we would have to encounter, but there were some really bad seasons in the 80s and into the definitely a part of the 1990s. But yeah, especially how I wasn't alive. I actually wasn't alive back in that era. I'm definitely grown a lot more older now, but want to talk about some of these recent histories and kind of resemble what we're kind of going to likely be seeing sometime, not so in the far future, but see. I think 91 would be the closest comparison, but we hadn't had like a really severe season, but since like the late 80s, since like sometime like the 1980s, 80s, the late 80s, technically there were 2 years down there, both in 85 and 88. There were some really bad seasons down there, 87 and 85. I think it was 1985 and 1988, where they had 2 really bad seasons, both of which where they were right. Yeah. But that was back at the time of Bauer and King Clancy. That was back when King Clancy and Harold Bauer were inside Big League Gardens. And this was back at the time where we started going through some really dark times with the team as far as we started going through some really turbulent time with the league, especially under Harold Bauer. Yeah. But at a time when the Maple Leafs were not great, how impressive that this team is still around today. But it was definitely bad, a lot of bad years, and a lot more years that were worse than that. And other friends had to go through that route, but this was the worst stretch of winning seasons without winning seasons. Really bad. It seems like really bad where they were losing seasons. Sometimes back a playoff spot, and a lot of time it was sometimes back a playoff spot, and the battery in here is so old that I can no longer support. I mean, I know that the battery in here is old. It's old. But my battery in my phone is old. Keep in mind that it says it's not getting any newer. But it ain't getting any newer. That's one thing. They're wondering if we may start shortening these streams. Normally I do these when I go home, but it's getting dark. It's dark earlier, and it's probably getting a lot cooler. Something like that. Getting a lot lower. And you notice that with temperature, it's dropping quickly. That's dropping quicker with how cold the temperatures are getting. Especially how cold it is. We might keep this going for at least an hour. Because we're not getting very many people on here. I think I'm finally considering not if I want to stop doing outside streams. If maybe it's time to maybe stop doing streaming up here. I know that it's not really worth keeping it going. Keeping this going. Yeah. Maybe videos are a lot more successful than streaming. It's essentially pretty much a dead channel anyway. So but the battery in here is a lot weaker now than it was many years ago. So we were just on here for an hour, but this era of Leaf Hockey where ultimately there were some really bad seasons in that era where but at the time they were in the one hole. And we now know my light bulb is now off of charging the flicker now. Meaning over time we are losing the back 72%. And I always use this a lot. But here we go. Can't believe that that 1984-85 season was only 4 years ago. when 4 years ago, and that was at the time when we had to be in a retrograde. Also at the time was also in Aries, so but just keep in mind that I was back in an era where the links were not great at all. So alright guys, we're gonna hop out now. Everyone has a wonderful day. We're keeping this stream short. So hope everyone has a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye bye everybody.